If I asked you what is a fighting game, you would probably have an answer within seconds, mostly because we have such a rigid checklist for what is or isn't a fighting game. Anything that doesn't conform to those standards is immediately discarded, which results in those games being unfairly overlooked. That's why in this video we want to highlight games that break away from the usual format, but still carry the same sort of appeal as other fighting games. We got a lot of games to talk about, so let's keep the intro short and get right into it. Dory Bash, made by Navi Studios, is the definition of an unusual fighting game, and it's also criminally overlooked, which admittedly is not too surprising. It's a small free indie game that released in 2006, and it always attracted a more niche audience. The way it looks and plays is simply not for everybody. However, I can't possibly exaggerate how interesting and fun this game is. So, the basic premise is that this is a turn-based fighting game. You and your opponent plan out your moves, and when the turn ends, those moves are executed simultaneously. But wait, there's more. You don't control your character by just pressing attack or move buttons, you control their balls. Each ball represents joints or muscles that you can manipulate in 4 different ways. Switching between extending and contracting gets the things moving. On top of that, you can switch between relaxing and holding, which basically determines if muscles are tensed or relaxed. And of course, this wouldn't be a fighting game without grapplers, so you can also click on your fist to make it grab your opponent. Very useful for tearing them apart. It sounds simple on paper, but in reality it resulted in a game with an insane skill ceiling and an immense amount of mind games, since some of the most destructive moves often require several turns, and both players constantly have to think multiple turns ahead. And if that gets boring, you have literal hundreds of different modes and maps to spice things up. Developers are still updating the game, it's still free, and the community just kept making more content. You can have a fight that follows judo rules, there is sword fighting, sumo, low gravity, parkour, obstacle courses, and many different novelty maps that just present you with all sorts of different scenarios. It's a super unique game, and I hope you give it a try. There is going to be a bit of a theme with turn-based fighters in this episode, and yet all of these games couldn't be further apart from each other. Your Only Move is Hustle is an indie game from a very talented solo dev known as Ivy's Sly. Much like Dory Bash, it is built around the turn-based format, where players constantly try to predict each other's actions and act accordingly. The art is simplistic, but don't let it deceive you. You know how simplified fighting games always sell it as skip the execution grind, get to the fun part, the strategy, the mind games? Well, Yumi Hustle actually does that without sacrificing the depth or complexity that you'd want in a fighting game. Despite the game's small roster, the characters themselves are so distinct that no 2 matchups feel the same. A cowboy versus wizard match is basically a whole different game compared to a match between a ninja and a robot. But here's where another genius feature comes into play: modding support. Yumi Hustle already has thousands of mods and over 500 user-made characters, turning it into a turn-based Mugen of sorts. So it's not only a great game that you can grab for cheap, but it's also a gift that keeps on giving. Now, this might be another blast from the past for some of you. Dive Kick feels like an FGC inside joke turned into a game. The whole concept is sort of built from the fact that dive kicks are usually pretty strong across the different fighting games. And now here's a whole game built entirely around it. It's almost similar to footsies from Hi Fight, but with a far more comedic tone. Unlike the indie games on the list though, this was made by the folks at Iron Galaxy, the people that brought you the Killer Instinct reboot and Rumbleverse, which can hopefully come back one day. You only have 2 buttons, dive and kick. You can probably guess what each of them does. On the ground you can also backdash with a kick button, and that's all you get for movement. The game comes down to making good use of your limited mobility, dive kick angle, and your character's special abilities. Much of the game's charm comes from countless parodies and jokes, like activating fraud detection warning when you go on a losing streak, or making fun of the gem system from Street Fighter Cross Tekken. And of course the roster speaks for itself. Where else can you beat up Markman while playing as Seth Killian? They even reference his unusual way of holding the stick. It's unlikely that something like this would be made these days, so Dive Kick might forever remain to be a unique artifact of the FGC's past. Our last turn-based fighting game for today, but one that also stands on its own 2 feet as an interesting and worthwhile interpretation of the genre. Mega Knagdown, made by D Hamster, is much closer to traditional fighting games than our other examples. Instead of subverting the format completely, it takes the decision-making aspect of fighting games and turns it into a whole game of its own. You still got your movement and attack buttons, alongside a throw and a block. Every character also has their own specials to spice things up. Can't really have a game focused around mind games if it doesn't have the iconic zoner versus grappler matchup. While the game is admittedly pretty simple, the pace of constant decisions still makes it entertaining, and it's worth a try just to play one of the most psychotic fighting game characters of all time. And now for something completely different. You probably didn't expect to see a cross between bullet hell and fighting games when you opened this video, but that's exactly what Acceleration of SaGa II delivers. Developed by Orange Juice, it's the 3rd game in the SaGa series, but only the 2nd to feature the online versus mode, which they knocked out of the park, by the way. Despite releasing in 2018, SaGa II has proper rollback netcode, and you can even adjust the delay before the match. But let's get on with the gameplay. The closest point of reference for the FGC crowd might be something like Gundam Maxi Boost, a high mobility arena fighter with a big focus on projectiles. Shave off the 3rd dimension and you basically have Acceleration of SaGa II. You don't really have to worry about combos, mix-ups or frame data. However, if you have good reactions, love sneaking in good pokes and spacing out your opponent, you will feel right at home here. Even though it's all about ranged combat, you still have a solid variety of playstyles thanks to each of the 15 characters having unique pros and cons. The game is super cheap at all times, but unfortunately not very popular, so hopefully you have a friend to play it with, because it's definitely worth checking out. Thank you for watching all the way to the end, and tell us if you would be interested in a part 2 for this video. We covered some of the more unusual fighting games here, but there's always more where that came from. However, until then, goodbye and see you next time.